Good evening. Can you hear me? Yes. Are you sure? Yes. Okay, I don't want you to fall asleep on me. Hello, Ignatian Teach-In Family 2017. It's my first time being here. They've tried to get me for years, but the calendar never worked. And it kept saying, you're missing one of the most exciting gatherings in the Catholic world. So you got a lot to live up to tonight. You're laughing. You shouldn't. Because I'm really counting on you to be one of the most exciting gatherings. Because this world needs some excitement. This world needs some excitement. And I know that we're in a Jesuit place with Ignatian values. Are there Jesuit priests out there? You'd raise your hand if you're a Jesuit or a Jesuit priest or even Jesuit brother. Okay, they're all there. I'm not a Jesuit. No, Jesuit educated, but I'm a real priest. Whoa! Gotcha. Gotta have some fun with all this. No, we're all real priests. What can I say? We're all real priests. Great. It's a joy to be with you, truly. And it's one of the things I was most looking forward to. I do a lot of speaking and talking about the issues that are going to face us, but it's actually joy to be with you. And we're going to do some really heavy stuff in the next 30 minutes. Because talking about racial justice in light of the magis isn't easy. Turn to someone next to you and say, it ain't gonna be easy. It's not gonna be easy, because if it were easy, we would all be not only talking about this, but we'd be well on our way to having a more just world. It ain't going to be easy. So tonight, we're going to do something that we usually don't do. We're going to have an honest, adult conversation about race. We're going to have an honest adult conversation about race, and when we have honest adult conversations about race, people may feel uncomfortable or embarrassed or ashamed or fearful, or angry, or overwhelmed, or helpless, or paralyzed. And if you feel any of those things in the next half hour, that makes you normal. Feel the emotion, because there are few issues that grip us and affect us emotionally than the issue of race. So feel the emotion, acknowledge it, but don't allow it to check you out. Feel it, and then come back in. So you've been forewarned that we're going to have an honest, adult conversation about things that matter. And I believe that you can handle it. I believe that you can handle it. because I teach people like you. And I have conversations like this in my classroom. And other professors say, oh, I don't want to talk about race in my classroom. Someone might get upset or people might act up. And I say, I've been doing this for over 25 years, and I've yet to have well, I have. And yet people have not been, but overwhelmingly, if you expect people to rise to the occasion, they will do it. And I have faith and confidence that you can do it. Amen? Oh, I love this. Hey, I'm going to bottle you and take you back to Fordham. Not that the Fordham people aren't good. Okay, Fordham, you're in the house? All right, good. So the questions I want to deal with are, what is the challenge of this cultural moment for Jesuit high schools, colleges, and universities? And what can or ought to be the contribution, the Ignatian contribution for racial justice that our society needs more than ever at this time, given our mission and our values? Now, the way we're going to do that, when we deal with social justice issues, we start by looking at the signs of the times. And the signs of the times is that phrase from the Second Vatican Council that happened well before many of you were born. But at that Vatican Council, this group of church leaders came together and they said that if we're going to speak with credibility and effectiveness to our world, we have to ground ourselves in what's really going on. What's going on in society that calls for a response in the light of the gospel? And you know what we're going to do? We're going to do that by looking at the experience of some really fine people that I know are in this room. Anyone who belongs to the class of 2018, the seniors in the room, would you please stand up? Seniors, stand up. All right, seniors, all right. The class of 2018. All right, now sit down. The class of 2018. And what we're going to do, a friend of mine from Georgetown University, Marcia, she did this, and I'm going to kind of borrow her idea and take it somewhere else. What we're going to do is we're going to look at our world through the lens of the class of 2018. What has been the experience of the graduating senior class when it comes to looking at our country through the lens of race? When the class of 2018 were freshmen in August, buying their school supplies, packing up their belongings, moving to the dormitory, in August of their freshman year was the year that Michael Brown Jr. was killed on the streets of Ferguson. And that summer ignited a series of protests, epitomized by the slogan, "Hands up, don't shoot." But Michael Brown was simply one of many, 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 all too many people who were killed, unarmed, African Americans, men and women, but mostly men, for doing nothing except shopping in a shopping mall, ringing a doorbell in the middle of the night and asking for help, or sitting on a playground swinging, playing with a toy gun. That was freshman year. Sophomore year, after you survived the terrors of freshman year, Charleston, South Carolina, where 9 people in a black church were in a Bible study, and they welcomed in a young man. And in the middle of that Bible study, while they were at prayer, he opened fire, killing 9 people. And it was the worst shooting in a black church that had happened since the 1960s. And it ignited a whole debate over the use of the Confederate flag and Confederate monuments that still is going on even today as we gather in this hotel that's on Jefferson Davis Highway. Some of you don't know who Jefferson Davis was, the president of the Confederacy. You got through sophomore year. For the class of 2018, junior year. Yeah. The presidential campaign. Let's not even get to the election yet. Let's just be with the campaign, where the leading contender began his journey to the White House by talking about Mexican rapists, how he had campaign rallies of build the wall, how he promised to have a Muslim travel ban, how he wanted to reinstate the unconstitutional practice of stop and frisk, how he denigrated a so-called Mexican judge who was actually a U.S. citizen, and how he talked about he was going to take care of the bad hombres and protect us from them. And then we called our inner city urban neighborhoods hotbeds of violence, encouraging us all to be afraid. How he engaged in conduct that even his own party, Paul Ryan, hardly a liberal, denounced as textbook racism. I was teaching Catholic social teaching at Fordham during the presidential campaign. The election was on Tuesday. That Thursday, I was supposed to give an exam. And I woke up on Wednesday, in addition to dealing with the news of the election, something happened that never happened in all of my years of teaching, and that is I had over 25 emails from students begging me to cancel or postpone the exam because they were too distracted, too distraught to study. That was junior year. And now, class of 2018, in your senior year, the year you're supposed to get ready to celebrate being sprung, our nation deals with Charlottesville, with marchers carrying tiki torches, walking through an American street in scenes that we have not seen since the days of the Civil Rights Movement. You haven't seen these kinds of scenes in America except on grainy black and white videos that your history teacher shows you. And we live in a time of increased polarization and division. In other words, class of 2018, and indeed all of us in the past 4 years, any one of these events would have been seismic, huge, but all of them taken together, we are living in a time of dealing with increased racial tension, polarization, and division such that this country has not experienced in over 2 generations. And in the midst of that, we look to millennials, the most diverse group of Americans that's ever existed. Except when we look at the millennial generation, oh, that's what we call y'all, or most of y'all. We find that your generation mirrors the divisions in American society. As this fall, the Gen Forward survey shows that when they ask the question that whether white nationalist groups are not very different from Black Lives Matter, we find that most millennials of color, the majority of millennials, say, well, no, they're not. They're very different, except that a slight majority of white millennials sees an equivalence between the white nationalists that marched in Charlotte and Black Lives Matter. Wow. Wow. That's the sign of the times. That's what's going on. What brings us here? Why do we begin our time together this weekend focused in on such a pressing, almost depressing issue? We must begin by looking at racism because racism is our most central justice challenge. No matter what issue you bring to the table, no matter what moves you personally, whether it's health insurance, healthcare access, immigration, mass incarceration, educational disparity, living wages, poverty, or even LGBTQ issues. Every social justice challenges that faces us in the United States is entangled with or exacerbated by racism against persons of color and African Americans in particular. Everyone. Everyone. In fact, these issues are so entangled and so enmeshed in racism, if you want to deal with educational access or immigration or caring for the environment or dealing with poverty, and you don't deal with race, you're on a bridge to nowhere. You're in a path to futility. Or you are saying that, yes, I'm for living wages, but only for white folks. Or yes, I'm for educational access, but only for white folks. Or I believe that all LGBTQ people are white. You laugh. But if you're going to be about justice and not going to be about race, that's what you're saying. That's why we have to deal with race. Except now we've got a problem, and that's this. There's probably no other issue that leaves us stammering, mute, tongue-tied, and no other issue that we'd rather be silent and avoid. As this man named Bryan Massingale, who I like to quote sometimes, has said, race too often leaves us uncomfortable, tongue-tied, embarrassed and stammering, limping from ineffective response to crisis-motivated engagement. In other words, we deal with race when we have to because all hell is breaking loose. Amen? Just want to make sure you're still with me now. You okay? You with me in the back over there? All right, good. Yeah, I got my teachers. Teachers have this thing, okay? They want to look at what's going on in the back of the room. So don't think because you're sitting in the back that keeps you safe, okay? In fact, a word to the wise, whenever you take a class, sit in the front. Because he's assuming that, or she's assuming that if you're in the front, you're the really cool people. So he doesn't have to worry about you. That's okay with you? Yeah, because they know they're cool, all right? Yeah. You just got here late, all right? That's all. Gotta have some fun with this, otherwise you get depressed. I usually say that when we're dealing with race, we have to overcome 3 obstacles. The first, we don't know what we're talking about. We don't know what we're talking about. We think that we're living in a so-called post-racial society, so what exactly is racism? We don't know how to talk about it, especially in interracial contexts. I know black folk, we talk about race among ourselves. I have it on pretty good authority that white people talk about race among themselves. I heard a rumor that Latinos talk about race among themselves. Even Asians, I've heard a rumor that they talk about race among themselves. But when we get together, we have this kind of code of silence where we don't say anything, or we become polite, or we just don't raise the issues. We don't know how to talk about it. And the third is that we don't really want to talk about it. Because if we talk about it, and especially the core reasons for racism, we have to go places that we don't want to go, and we have to tell some very deep, uncomfortable truths. So 3 obstacles. We don't know what we're talking about, we don't know how to talk about it, and we really don't want to talk about it. So let's deal with the first of these first. We don't know what we're talking about, and let's spend some time and talk about what exactly do we mean by racism. There's a common sense understanding. This is what I talk about in the book. So if you haven't read the book yet, this is chapter 1. Okay, the common sense understanding of racism is that we're talking about individual acts of meanness, usually but not always directed against persons of color. So we're talking about person A doing something negative to person B, person A usually but not always being white, doing something deliberately, consciously, intentionally to person B, usually but not always black or Latino because of the color of his or her skin. It's obvious, it's deliberate, it's intentional, it's easily photographed, and you know what you're doing and why you're doing it. Now, that kind of understanding of racism means that racism usually is a problem of bad white people, like the ones who march in Charlottesville. And that kind of understanding is important. It's a problem, but it's not the problem. And because the problem with this kind of common sense understanding is twofold. One, it doesn't take us deep enough into where we need to go. And two, it can too easily leave all of us off the hook. Because after all, we're the good people. We're here at Ignatian Family Weekend. We're here because we actually believe in these Jesuit values. We're giving up our weekend to be here. You didn't come to Washington, D.C. just to kind of hang out. Well, some of you did. But, you know, we don't use the N-word. We don't mind sitting next to someone who looks a little different than us. And so this kind of understanding leaves us off the hook and makes us all feel like we're the good folk. So we got to go deeper. And the way we're going to get to go deeper is by looking at the case study of Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan, you've heard about them with the contaminated water situation. The contaminated water system of Flint, Michigan the crisis started in April of 2014, and the water there is still not safe to drink over 3 years later. I mean, we're talking about water that doesn't smell funny. It was obviously brown. And for over a year and a half, the public authorities said, the water is fine to drink. No worries here. No problem. Even though later it was found to have levels of lead contamination, which the EPA said far exceeded the level that would be deemed toxic. The Michigan Civil Rights Commission, their official report, And they asked the question, would the Flint water crisis have been allowed to happen in Birmingham, Ann Arbor, or Grand Rapids, East Grand Rapids, all very white areas of the state? And they answered, we believe the answer is no. And then they went and asked the further question, was race a factor in the Flint water crisis? Our answer is an unreserved and undeniable yes. In other words, what happened in Flint would not have happened except because of the social vulnerability of the people, because of the social and racial class to which they belonged. And they pointed out it wasn't because public officials said, oh, you're black, so we're not going to take care of you. Because that would be person A doing something to person B. No, they pointed out there was something more insidious and more subtle going on here. It was an example of what they called racially selective sympathy and indifference, which refers to the unconscious refusal to extend the same level of recognition and care to another that we would give to members of our own group because of pervasive cultural implicit bias. Because we live in the society that we do, in which meanings and skin values are color-coded, we know when we look at someone, we carry implicit biases and associations. And those implicit biases and associations, when they become widespread and commonly shared, they lead to people making public policies that benefit others and disadvantage some. Now, that's really complicated, so let me break it down for you by giving you a very common example. I was once giving a talk to a group of women religious. We call them nuns, but they want to be called women religious now, so we're calling them women religious. We gave talk to a group of nuns once, and at the break, one of them came up to me and said, Father Massingale, you are so intelligent and so articulate, you must have been taught by one of our sisters. And I said, no, I was taught by my mama and my daddy. And she looked at me and she didn't understand what I was talking about. I said, sister, would you have ever gone to a white priest and told him, you're so intelligent and articulate, you must be taught by one of our sisters? Didn't you assume that the only reason I could be intelligent or articulate was because some white person made me that way? She walked away and didn't talk to me for the rest of the weekend. But I wasn't calling her a racist because she did not deliberately, consciously, and deliberately try to insult me. That wasn't her purpose. What happened was that she was going on automatic pilot and was assuming that because she was going by what she had been taught. Pervasive cultural implicit bias answers the question, who counts as we? Who counts as us? And that racially selective sympathy and indifference, that some count and some don't, or some lives are more disposable than others, or to use George Orwell's George Orwell's Animal Farm. I love that book. At the very end, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. That's racially selective sympathy and indifference. And that leads us to something which is really uncomfortable. We heard the phrase white supremacy used by those four marvelous young women who were here earlier. When we're talking about racism in the United States, we're talking about a system of white supremacy. And there are many ways to understand white supremacy, but white supremacy basically is the assumption that this country, that its political institutions, its cultural heritage, its social policies, its public spaces, that they belong to white people in a way that they do not belong to others. It's a fundamental assumption that some belong in the space and others have to justify being there. That some belong there and others we suspect are there only because someone made special allowances for them. That's what racism is. And that's the most uncomfortable truth we face as Americans. Because we want to believe in America that, everybody is just as racist as everybody else, so don't get on me. But I gotta let you in on a secret. If it were up to people of color, this would have been dealt with a long time ago. And this is the deepest reason why racism is so often avoided or only dealt with in very superficial ways, because in this country, white comfort sets the limits of engagement. It's amazing to me whenever I give a talk like this, sooner or later someone will come up to me with the question, how can we talk about this on my campus, in my classroom, and not make white people uncomfortable? Now think about that question. Think about that. Why is it that the only group in America that's never supposed to feel uncomfortable about race are white people? Now, I'm not saying that to beat up on white people. So if you're white, please hear me. Are you listening? I'm not beating up on all white people. Don't put that in the evaluation. Because if you do, you're breaking a commandment, the 8th one. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. You remember that? Well, maybe not. Anyway, different theology class. But what we're talking about is the fact that in the United States, we only will deal with race in such ways that do not make a certain group uncomfortable, and yet there is no way to have an adult, honest, intelligent conversation about race without making white people uncomfortable as a group, because race exists precisely to benefit one group and not another. And that's the uncomfortable truth that we need to be honest about. That's what we mean when we say, if we're going to deal with this honestly and intelligently. And so as a result, there are many ways to understand racism. As a political issue, as a sociological issue. For me, as a believer, the reason why I'm concerned about racism is because racism is a soul sickness. Racism is that interior dis-ease, that warping of the human spirit that enables us to create communities where some matter and some do not. Or to quote a fellow scholar, the real meaning of race comes down to this: is this someone I should care about? Or to quote these two paired protesters at a Black Lives Matter rally, is his life worth less than mine? Is his life worth more than mine? And I saw this soul sickness at work when I was flying through an airport, and they were interviewing the uncle of Michael Brown. And he was grieving the loss of his nephew. And when people are grieving and when they are sad, they don't always think about what they're going to say. He was angry, and he was upset, and he was tearful, and his voice was loud. And I watched the faces of those who were mostly white staring at the CNN on the airport television. And I looked, and instead of seeing sympathy or empathy or sorrow or compassion or understanding, I saw stone cold anger. And I wondered, what can so poison the soul that we can't see the grief of an uncle and understand his pain? And this leads us to the magis. The magis, as a response to soul sickness. The magis. We hear that word a lot. I hear in some Jesuit circles that some people are interpreting magis as meaning that you go to a Jesuit high school or college so you can become a better accountant or a better lawyer or something like that. If that's what you understand magis to be, flush it, because that ain't it. Magis. The magis is the call to become big-souled people. It's a call to, it's the antidote, a response to the soul sickness that so keeps us imprisoned so we can't hear another person's pain. I'm haunted lately by Albert Einstein, of all people. And I'm not a physics person at all. In fact, it's my worst grade I ever got in college. Physics for dummies. It was actually called Physics for Liberal Arts Majors, but the same thing. And Einstein said that the world we've created is a product of our thinking, and it cannot be changed without changing our thinking. If we want to change the world, we have to change our thinking. And then he said, no problem can be solved at the level of consciousness that created it. If we want to change the world, we have to see the world anew. We need a new way of seeing, a new way of being, a new way of loving, a new way of living. And that's what the magis is about. The magis, the more, is probably the most subversive and awesome word in the whole lexicon of Ignatian vocabulary. We've all heard cura personalis, yes or no? Oh, yeah, you got that one down, yeah. You heard men and women for others? Oh, yeah, woo! Yeah, we all got that one down. But the magis is the latest in the vocabulary. The magis is that longing, that yearning for what is beyond us. It's that sacred, holy restlessness that leaves us dissatisfied. The magis is that longing for more that breaks our hearts and breaks us open so that we can become co-creators of the new. The magis lures us what's beyond us. And it calls us to be bigger than we ever thought that we could be. That's the magis, that holy restlessness that breaks our hearts so that they can be open to something new. Magis. Magis, in the biblical sense, can be illustrated by the story of the prodigal son. We all know the story of a man who had two sons. The younger one says, hey, give me what's coming to me now. So he goes off and he squanders it on, well, lots of things he shouldn't be squandering it on. Something to do with sex, sex. But that's another talk. Next year I can talk about that if you want. So, I'm serious. I'm really willing to come back and talk about that. I know you'll come back for it too. But the most important part of the whole story is that after he's gone through his money and after he's down and out on his luck, it says in the Bible, coming to his senses. He wakes up and realizes, this is crazy. And the biblical sense of coming to his senses is he leaves his world of delusion and he comes to his true self. He becomes the man that he's supposed to be, and he sees through the illusion. And it's only when he sees through the illusion and begins to make the journey home that he discovers that his father has been waiting for him all along, but he couldn't see it until he's willing to come to his true self and come to his senses. And that's what the magis is asking us to do, to come to our senses and to see through the lies that say that some people are more important and more expendable, or less expendable and more value simply because they have less skin coloring. We've built a whole society on an illusion, a delusion, and a lie, and it's time that we came to our senses. And that's what the magis does for us by stretching us beyond this craziness. By stretching us beyond this craziness. And the way we get beyond the craziness when we're physically ill, we enter into rehabilitation. When we are soul sick, we need to be recreated. We need to be recreated. We need to be new beings. We need a new way of thinking, a new way of living, a new way of loving. Are you ready for a magis? Are you ready to be recreated? Are you ready to be something other than what we are? And my grandmama over here right now, she say, y'all are fibbing. Because nobody wants to be recreated. No one wants the magis. No, the Holy Spirit, the last thing most of us want on any given Sunday is for the Holy Spirit to actually show up. Because if the Holy Spirit actually showed up, then Who knows what the Spirit would do to us? I know for myself, if I knew half of what I knew when I was your age, I would say, maybe not, Lord. Everybody wants to improve, but nobody wants to change. No, we are not ready for the magis. But the good news is that we don't have to be. Because when we need to be ready, the Spirit of God will make us ready and give us what we need. And more than that, we don't do it on our own. We do it with each other. Because racial justice is a magis relay race. And the goal is not for us to cross the finish line and to enter into the racial promised land. Our goal is to simply run the race and do our part so that we can pass the baton to those who will come after us. And you know what? You don't have to be a Democrat or a political liberal or progressive to do that, because I know we all cheer for Democrats in this room, but I think there is some closet Republicans here too. And that's okay. Oh, you're all looking around and saying, ooh, is it I, Lord? So let me tell you a story about this relay race. I was teaching this course called Racial Justice in the Christian Church. And I noticed one semester that the head of the college Republicans was enrolled for my course. The president of the college Republicans. I'm like, oh my God. And it was a kind of rocky experience in the beginning. Because every time I would say something, he'd raise his hand and would sow just enough reasonable doubt around the room to basically say, I gotcha. And I had to do something I never did before. I had to dig down deep, and I had to pray, and I had to say, Lord, you've put him in my classroom for a reason. So I need to stop wishing he weren't there. I'm being honest. I have to stop wishing he weren't there, and Lord, I need your help to help me love him the way you do. And you know, something happened when I began to pray and was honest about that. I stopped getting angry with him, and he became quiet. And at first, I feared he had checked out of the course. But you know what happened was that after 6 weeks of silence from him, he walked in one day. We were going to discuss Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham City jail, and he said, Father Massingale, this is the best thing we've read all semester. I said, really? Okay. It turned out, in the class discussion, he actually read it and digested it, and he was participating. And so at the end of the course, during a course evaluation, I asked my students, what have you learned this semester that confirmed what you believed when you entered the course? And he wrote down and he said, nothing I learned this semester confirmed anything I believed prior. And he said, you may have noticed that I had checked out, but I listened because I learned that what I needed to do was to listen to the pain of my fellow students. And so when I leave this course, he wrote, I still leave as a conservative Republican, but now I know that if I'm going to be a Christian conservative Republican, I cannot be deaf to racism. That's the magis. That's the magis. And so what I'm doing is I'm running my little race here, keeping my eyes fixed on Jesus, as it says in Hebrews, Now that we are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, let us continue to run the race, leaving behind every encumbrance and weight of sin, keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, who is our final goal and our perfection. And so I'm running my race, and it's not for me to reach the finish line. It's up to me to do what I'm supposed to do so I can hand the baton to someone else, to 25 other people who are in this room. You are part of the relay race. We are not necessarily going to reach the finish line. You may not be the one who breaks the tape at the end of the race, but if you don't run your race and do what you need to do, then we can't win at all. And so, people, I'm asking you to join me in the race, to do your part so that we can together create a new world. I've taken to ending my talks with the last words of my book on racial justice. So you don't read the whole book, this is how it ends. The magis, the more, the call to be a bigger souled person. The magis is both a challenge and a hope. As we go forth to be people who pursue racial justice, let us remember that social life is made by human beings. The society we live in is the result of human choices and decisions. That means that human beings can change things. You can change things. For what human beings break, divide, and separate, we can, with God's help, also heal, unite, and restore. What is now does not have to be. And there lies our hope and our challenge. Let the church say, amen.